The motorboat accelerated toward them. Jack stopped rowing. The little boat rocked in the wake as the larger craft came alongside. Reed turned to look at the men aboard. There were 4 of them, all armed. None appeared particularly interested in rescuing anyone. One of the men raised a hand. "Boat, hold your position." Jack did. The motorboat drew closer. "Who are you?" Jack glanced at Reed, then at Harris. Neither man said a word. Jack turned back toward the strangers. "Archaeological expedition." The man frowned. "Archaeological? That's right. What are you doing here?" "Studying the island locals." The man's eyes moved toward the jungle. "Locals? Yes. How many of you?" "3. And how did you get here?" "We were dropped off." "By whom?" Jack shrugged. "Our expedition vessel." "When?" "A couple of weeks ago." "And you're still here?" "We're supposed to be." The man stared at him. "How long?" "Few months." The answer seemed to interest him. "Then you intend to remain on the island?" "Until we're picked up." Jack pointed toward the wreck. "Though I'm beginning to think our timing could have been better." The man followed his gaze. "You saw the ship crash?" "We did." Jack leaned slightly against the oar. "We were wondering what happened ourselves." The man didn't answer. Jack waited. The silence stretched. Then the stranger asked, "Did you see anyone escape?" Jack shook his head. "Not from where we were." "Where were you?" "Near the village." That answer was easy. It was even true. Jack could see the man considering it. "You've spoken with the natives?" "That's why we're here." "And they told you nothing about the wreck?" Jack gave a small smile. "We don't exactly have a common language." Another of the armed men said something quietly to his companion. Jack couldn't make out the words. The first man looked back at him. "Have you been aboard the wreck?" "No." "Why not?" Jack gestured toward the damaged ship. "We assumed whoever was aboard could take care of themselves." The man studied him. Jack decided to turn the questioning around. "So who are you?" The man paused. "We're conducting an investigation." "Into the wreck?" "Among other things." Jack nodded slowly. "Well, I hope you find what you're looking for." The man looked at him. "We may have more questions for you." "Any time." Jack smiled. "Assuming you're still around when our ship comes to collect us." For the first time, the man seemed genuinely uncomfortable. It was only a flicker, but Jack noticed. The stranger looked toward the wreck, then back toward Jack. "Stay away from it." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "It's dangerous." Jack glanced at the armed men. "So are you." Reed gave him a quick look. Jack smiled politely. The stranger's expression didn't change. "Return to your camp." Jack nodded. "Of course." The motorboat pulled away. Jack waited until it had passed behind the Argosy. Only then did he start rowing again. Harris let out a breath. "You think they bought it?" Jack looked toward the wreck. "I think they bought enough of it." Reed frowned. "Why would they believe 3 archaeologists were dropped off here?" "Because 3 archaeologists being dropped off here makes more sense than 3 shipwreck survivors pretending they aren't shipwreck survivors." Harris looked back toward the motorboat. "They're going to search the wreck?" Jack nodded. "Exactly." He pulled harder on the oars. "And we're going to get there first." The Argosy loomed above them. Jack guided the rowboat alongside the hull, and Reed caught a dangling rope and secured them. Harris looked up at the battered ship. "Doesn't look any better from this side." "It doesn't have to." Jack climbed aboard. "Just has to still have things we can use." Reed followed, then Harris. For a moment, the 3 stood silently on the deck. The ship groaned beneath their feet. Jack looked back toward the island. The beach was barely visible in the distance. "All right. Food, water, rope, canvas, tools. Anything we can use to build that raft." Harris nodded. "And the radio? If it's salvageable." They split up. The Argosy was a wreck inside as well as out. Cabinets hung open, crates had shifted across the deck, and water dripped steadily through the damaged ceiling. But there was still plenty to salvage. Harris found a coil of rope. "Got one." Jack took it. "Good. Keep looking." Reed returned with a folded canvas tarp. "Found this." Jack nodded. "Perfect." They continued through the ship. It was strangely quiet. Too quiet. Jack eventually found himself in the radio room. The equipment was damaged, but not completely destroyed. He crouched beside it. "Think you can get this working?" Reed examined the controls. "Maybe." "Maybe's good enough." Harris entered carrying several water containers. "Found these." Jack smiled. "That's better than the radio." They continued gathering supplies. For the first time since the crash, Jack felt as though they might actually have a way off the island. Then Harris called from the next compartment. "Jack!" Jack hurried over. Harris was standing beside a storage locker. Inside were several medical supplies, tools, and containers of preserved food. Jack looked at the shelves. "We'll take all of it." Harris began gathering the supplies. Reed appeared in the doorway. "There's more in the galley." "Good." Jack looked around the ship. "Let's make this quick." A faint sound came from somewhere below them. Everyone stopped. A metallic scrape echoed through the lower deck. Harris looked toward the stairs. "Did you hear that?" Jack nodded. Another sound followed. Then silence. Reed lowered his voice. "Could be the ship settling." Jack drew his pistol. "Could be." He looked toward the dark stairwell, but we're taking chances. The three men moved carefully toward the lower deck. They had come aboard looking for supplies. Now they had another problem. They weren't sure they were alone. Jack led the way down the stairs. The lower deck was dark. Water sloshed across the floor with every movement of the ship. Harris followed close behind, pistol drawn. Reed came last. They stopped at the bottom. Nothing. Jack looked down the passage. "Hello?" For several seconds, there was no answer. Then came a weak voice. "Help." Jack turned toward it. "Where are you?" A pause. "Here." They followed the voice into a damaged storage compartment. A man was trapped beneath a fallen beam. He was soaked, bruised, and exhausted, but alive. Reed immediately knelt beside him. "Easy, we're getting you out." The man grabbed Reed's arm. "Wait, what's wrong?" "The men." Jack crouched beside him. "What men?" "The ones upstairs." Jack and Harris exchanged a glance. "You saw them?" The survivor nodded. "They came aboard yesterday." Jack looked toward the ceiling. "How many?" "4." "What did they want?" The man shook his head. "I don't know." "Did they ask you anything?" "They wanted to know if anyone else survived." Jack's expression tightened. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing." The man coughed. "I didn't know." That was enough for Jack. "Reed." They began shifting the beam. It took all three men to move it far enough for the survivor to crawl free. Reed helped him to his feet. "Can you walk?" "I think so." "Then we're getting you out of here." Jack looked toward the stairs, quietly. They started back. Then they heard footsteps above them. Jack immediately held up his hand. Everyone froze. Voices drifted down through the stairwell. The armed men had returned. Jack looked at the injured survivor, then at the only other way out. There wasn't one. He pointed toward a narrow storage compartment. Inside. They squeezed into the cramped space. Jack pulled the door almost shut. Through the gap, they watched the stairwell. Boots appeared. One man descended, then another. They were talking quietly. Jack couldn't make out everything they said, but one sentence reached him clearly. "Search the lower deck." The men separated. One walked toward their hiding place. Jack slowly raised his pistol. The footsteps came closer, then stopped. The man turned away. Jack waited. The footsteps faded. He lowered the pistol. Reed whispered, "How do we get him to the boat?" Jack shook his head. "Not yet." The survivor looked frightened. "Why?" Jack pointed toward the ceiling. "They're between us and the exit." He looked at the man. "Stay quiet." The survivor nodded. Jack waited and waited. Then another sound came from the passage. A door opening. A voice. "There's someone here." Jack's eyes widened. The men had found something. The search was moving closer. The armed men found the survivor's hiding place before Jack could move. The door opened. A rifle was immediately pointed inside. The injured man raised his hands. "Don't shoot." The armed officer looked at him. "You're from the Argosy." The man nodded. "Yes." "How many survivors?" The man hesitated. "I don't know." "Where are they?" "I don't know." The officer stared at him. "You were aboard the ship." "I was trapped." "You've seen the others." "I haven't." The officer stepped closer. "Where is your camp?" The survivor shook his head. "I don't know." Jack watched from the darkness farther down the passage. Reed was beside him. Harris had his pistol ready. Jack silently shook his head. "Don't." There were too many of them, and they had the high ground. The officer questioned the survivor again. The answers didn't change. He genuinely knew nothing. Finally, the officer lowered his weapon. For one brief moment, Jack thought they were going to let him go. Then the officer turned to the others. "He's of no further use." A single gunshot echoed through the ship. Reed flinched. Harris clenched his jaw. Jack remained perfectly still. The project men searched the compartment. They found nothing else. One of them looked toward the passage. Think there are others aboard? The officer considered it. Possibly. Should we search again? Yes. Jack's eyes widened. The men began moving toward them. Jack grabbed Reed's shoulder and pointed toward a side passage. They moved silently. Harris followed. The three slipped around a corner just as the project men entered the corridor they'd occupied moments earlier. Jack found an open hatch. Down. They climbed through. The hatch closed behind them. Above, boots passed overhead. Jack listened. The armed men were searching the ship. They knew somebody else was aboard. They just didn't know who. Jack looked at Reed, then Harris. They had the supplies they came for. Now they needed to get off the Argosy without becoming the next loose end. Jack pressed himself against the wall and listened. Boots moved somewhere above them, slowly, deliberately. The men were searching the ship. Reed whispered, "They know we're here." Jack nodded. Harris looked toward the hatch behind them. "Can we get back to the deck?" "Not that way." Another set of footsteps passed overhead. Jack looked down the narrow passage. "Come on." They moved. The lower deck was half flooded, forcing them to pick their way through ankle-deep water. Every step threatened to send a splash echoing through the ship. Harris pointed ahead. "That way." Jack looked. A narrow maintenance passage led toward the stern. They followed it. Behind them, a voice called out, "Check below." Jack stopped. "They're coming." Reed looked around. "We can't outrun them in here." Jack spotted a hatch above them. He reached up and pulled. It opened into a storage compartment. Up. One by one, they climbed inside. Jack pulled the hatch nearly closed. Moments later, footsteps splashed through the passage beneath them. The three men held their breath. One of the strangers stopped directly below. Jack could see his boots through the gap. The man looked around, then continued. Jack waited several seconds before opening the hatch. "Move." They crawled through the storage compartment and found another door. It opened onto the aft deck. Ocean stretched behind them. Their rowboat was still tied alongside. Jack grinned. "We're out." Harris looked toward the other end of the ship. Not quite. A man appeared on the upper deck. He spotted them. "Hey!" Jack grabbed the rope. "Jump!" They scrambled over the railing. The three hit the rowboat almost simultaneously. A rifle cracked. The bullet struck the water beside them. Reed untied the rope. Jack grabbed the oars. "Go!" They pushed away from the Argosy. Another shot rang out. Jack rowed hard. The motorboat was still nearby. Its engine roared to life. Harris looked behind them. "They're coming." Jack looked toward the island, then toward the open water. If they went straight back to camp, the men would follow them, and the camp was where everyone else was. Jack changed direction. "Hold on." The rowboat turned toward a rocky stretch of coastline farther down the island. Reed looked at him. "What are you doing?" "Taking them somewhere they don't need to be." The motorboat followed. Jack kept rowing. The rocky shore grew closer. Then, at the last moment, he turned the boat toward a narrow inlet. The motorboat slowed. Jack saw the hesitation. That was all he needed. Now. He jumped overboard. Reed and Harris followed. They disappeared beneath the shadow of the rocks. The rowboat drifted on. The motorboat entered the inlet moments later. The men found an empty boat. One of them shouted. Jack, Reed, and Harris watched silently from behind the rocks. The motorboat circled. Once, twice. Then it turned back toward the Argosy. Jack waited until the engine faded into the distance. Only then did he smile. "Come on." They reached the camp after dark. Finch was the first to see them. He hurried over. "Where have you been?" Jack dropped the coil of rope onto the ground. "Shopping." Finch stared at him. "At the bottom of the ocean?" "Almost." Reed began unloading the supplies. Food, water, canvas, tools, enough to make the others gather around. For a moment, there was excitement. Then Harris spoke. We weren't alone. The excitement disappeared. Finch looked at Jack. "What happened?" Jack sat down. "We found another survivor." Finch's expression changed. "Another?" "Alive when we found him." Jack paused. "Not when we left." Nobody spoke. Finch understood. "The men from the boat?" Jack nodded. "They searched the ship." "Who are they?" "I don't know." "Then what do they want?" Jack looked toward the darkness beyond the camp, the Argosy. Reed shook his head. "Not exactly." He glanced at Jack. They were looking through the radio room, the ship's records. Anything that might tell them what the crew knew. Finch frowned. About what? We don't know. Jack stood. But we know one thing. He looked around at the survivors. They don't know where we are. Harris nodded. We made sure of that. Jack looked toward the village. Their cover story was still intact. As far as the strangers knew, the three men were archaeologists staying near the island's village. Nothing more. Jack picked up the coil of rope. We go back tomorrow. Finch stared at him. Back to the Argosy? We need more supplies. You heard the gunfire. I did. Jack looked toward the distant ocean. That's why we go back. Reed understood. They'll be watching the wreck. Exactly. Jack smiled grimly. And now we know they're watching. He looked at the half-built raft lying nearby. We just have to make sure they don't see us. Far out on the water, a tiny light appeared, then disappeared. Jack watched it for several seconds. The game had begun. The trip back to camp was uneventful. Jack was grateful for that. They had managed to strip the Argosy of another useful collection of supplies without running into the armed men again. Rope, canvas, several barrels, tools, and whatever radio components Reed thought might be useful were piled into the rowboat. The Argosy itself was beginning to look less like a ship and more like a carcass being picked clean. When they reached the beach, several of the survivors came down to help. Jack stepped out of the boat. Careful with those. Reed immediately began gathering his salvaged radio parts. Harris carried the rope toward the raft. Jack looked around the camp. Everyone seemed to be here. Then he noticed Zerny sitting on an overturned crate, watching him. Zerny gave him a broad smile. Good trip? Jack looked at him. Define good. You came back alive. That's a fairly low standard. It's an island. Standards change. Jack shook his head and continued unloading. Zerny followed him. You missed our visitors. Jack stopped. What visitors? The armed gentlemen. Jack's expression hardened. When? While you were away. What did they want? Zerny shrugged. They asked about you. Jack looked toward the others. Did they find the camp? No. Did they see anyone? Several people. Jack stared at him. Zerny raised his hands. Before you start blaming me, I didn't tell them anything. Jack waited. Zerny smiled. Not intentionally. Zerny. They asked where you three were. And? I told them you were with the expedition. Jack frowned. That's what they already believe. Exactly. Zerny looked pleased with himself. I didn't see the harm. What else? They asked where you were staying. Jack's expression changed. And what did you say? Zerny pointed toward the jungle, near the village. Jack sighed. That's still what they believe. Good. Did they ask anything else? Zerny thought. They wanted to know whether we'd spoken to anyone else from the ship. Jack looked at him. And? I told them no. That answer surprised Jack. You told them the truth? Zerny shrugged. I occasionally do. Jack almost smiled. Occasionally? I don't want to make a habit of it. Harris approached carrying the rope. What happened? Zerny talked to our visitors. Harris looked at Zerny. You weren't supposed to. I wasn't instructed not to. Jack stared at him. You knew exactly what I meant. Zerny grinned. Probably. Jack shook his head. At least the lie was still intact. As far as the armed men knew, there were 3 archaeologists staying near the village. They had no idea there was a camp full of Argosy survivors only a short distance away. Jack looked toward the wreck. Did they go back to the ship? Zerny nodded. They've been spending most of their time there. Jack looked at Reed. Then we've got a little time. Reed held up the salvaged radio components. Maybe. Jack looked at the parts. What are you thinking? About our radio. Reed laid the salvaged components beside the camp's battered radio. The survivors gathered around. Jack watched as the doctor carefully examined each piece. You really think you can make this work? I think I can make it work better. That's not the same thing. No. Reed picked up a damaged component, but it's closer than we were yesterday. He began dismantling the radio. Harris crouched beside him. Anything I can do? Hold this. Harris did. Not that. Harris moved his hand. That. Harris adjusted it. Perfect. Jack watched them work. For once, nobody was talking about the jungle. Nobody was talking about the armed men. Nobody was talking about the wreck. They were simply trying to fix something, something that might give them a chance to leave. Zerny sat nearby, watching. You know, he said, If this works, I have a suggestion. Jack didn't look up. No, you haven't heard it. I know you. Zerny smiled. Fair enough. Reed connected another salvaged component. The radio hissed. Everyone stopped. Reed looked at it. Don't touch anything. The hiss continued. Then came a faint crackle. Harris grinned. Is that good? Reed smiled. Very. Jack stepped closer. Can you transmit? Not yet. Receive? Possibly. Reed adjusted the dial. Static filled the camp. Nothing more. He tried again. The static changed. For a brief moment, there was something beneath it. A faint electrical pulse. Then silence. Reed sat back. Jack waited. Well? Reed looked at the radio. I think I can fix it. A smile slowly crossed Jack's face. How long? Couldn't say. Try. Reed nodded. He returned to work. Jack looked out toward the ocean. The Argosy was still visible in the distance. Somewhere around it were the men who had killed one of their fellow survivors. But here, for the moment, the camp was quiet. They had supplies. They had a raft taking shape. And now they might have a radio. A way to tell the outside world they were alive. A way home. Zerny leaned toward Harris. So, Harris looked at him. What's your suggestion? Jack immediately turned. Don't encourage him. Zerny laughed. The camp slowly returned to work. For the first time since the wreck, Jack allowed himself to think that perhaps they might actually get off the island. He didn't know yet that the island had other plans for them. But for tonight, that was enough.